Nietzsche, Why the Strongest Minds Are the Most Feared. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from growing. You start seeing things the people around you don't see. You start asking questions they stopped asking years ago, and slowly, without anyone announcing it, a distance opens up. Not because you left, because you moved. You didn't plan this. Nobody sits down at 17 and decides to outgrow everyone they love. It happens the way erosion happens, slowly, and then all at once you're standing on a different shoreline, and the old one is just a shape in the fog. Maybe it started with a book. Maybe a sentence someone said that cracked something open in you. Maybe you just woke up one morning, and the things that used to satisfy everyone around you, the safe job, the weekend routines, the unexamined opinions repeated like prayers no one believes anymore, felt like wearing someone else's clothes. You kept putting them on, but the fit was wrong now, and everyone could tell. And the worst part isn't the distance. The worst part is that no one did anything wrong. They didn't betray you. You didn't betray them. You just started moving in a direction they couldn't follow. And now the room feels different when you walk in. The conversation stalls half a second too long. You can feel them deciding you've changed, and not meaning it as a compliment. You start editing yourself, keeping your real thoughts behind your teeth at dinner, laughing at things that don't strike you as funny anymore, performing the old version of yourself because the new one makes people nervous. And at night, alone, you feel the weight of all that performance, and you wonder if this is what the rest of your life looks like. A long, slow act of translation between who you are and who they need you to be. Friedrich Nietzsche knew this feeling the way a man knows the walls of a cell he built himself. He was born in 1844 in a small Prussian town called Recurrence, the son of a Lutheran pastor who died when Friedrich was 4. The boy watched his father deteriorate, a brain ailment that took him slowly in front of his family. Then, less than a year later, his younger brother died too. By the age of 5, Nietzsche had already learned what most people spend decades avoiding, that the world takes things from you without explanation and offers nothing in return. The boy was quiet, intense, almost alarmingly gifted. He devoured books the way other children devoured sweets. His schoolmates respected him but kept their distance. There was something about him that was too serious, too inward, too much. By the time he was 24 years old, he was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel. 24, no doctorate, no habilitation. They gave him the chair because his work was so extraordinary that the normal rules didn't apply. Imagine that for a moment. You are 24, and the academic world has already decided you are exceptional. You walk into lecture halls where your students are older than you. You are brilliant, and everyone knows it. And for a brief window, it seems like the world is going to make room for what you are. It didn't. His first book, The Birth of Tragedy, was savaged by his own field. The philologists said it wasn't rigorous enough. The philosophers said it wasn't philosophy. What it actually was, a radical reimagining of Greek culture through the lens of music and myth, an argument that art, not reason, was the deepest response to human suffering, was too strange for anyone to hold. It arrived in the wrong century, and it knew it. Nietzsche's academic career never recovered. The colleagues who had praised him began to look away. The lecture halls thinned. He was 28 and already becoming invisible. And then there was Wagner. Richard Wagner, the composer, the titan, the man whose operas felt like earthquakes. Nietzsche loved him, not casually. The way you love someone who seems to prove that the world you dream about actually exists. Their friendship was one of those rare collisions between two enormous minds, and for a few years it burned like a signal fire. Nietzsche visited Wagner's estate at Tribschen, spent long evenings in conversation with him and his wife Cosima, and for the first time in his life felt that he had found a peer, someone who understood the scale of what he was trying to do. Nietzsche saw in Wagner the possibility of a new culture, a rebirth of the tragic spirit that had animated ancient Greece, not through philosophy, but through music, through the raw confrontation with suffering that only art could stage. But Wagner saw in Nietzsche something more useful, an acolyte, a brilliant young man who could give his art intellectual legitimacy, a disciple. And when Nietzsche began to think for himself, when he started pulling away from Wagner's orbit, questioning the nationalism, the anti-Semitism, the creeping Christianity of Wagner's later work, the way Parsifal reeked of incense and submission, the friendship didn't just end, it shattered, not with a conversation, with a silence that calcified into permanent estrangement. Nietzsche would write about Wagner for the rest of his sane life, not with indifference, with the kind of surgical precision that only comes from a wound that never fully closed. He wrote an entire book, The Case of Wagner, years after the friendship ended. That's not criticism, that's haunting. Then came Lou Salome, a Russian-born intellectual 21 years old, fierce and free in a way that Nietzsche had never encountered in a woman. She had a mind that moved as fast as his. She didn't defer to him. She challenged him. He fell in love with her almost immediately. He proposed. She refused. She chose his friend Paul Ray instead, and the whole arrangement collapsed into recrimination and betrayal, with Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth poisoning what little remained. And Nietzsche was left with a rejection that confirmed something he may have already suspected, that the kind of mind he had was not the kind that gets to be loved easily, that the very qualities that made him extraordinary made him, in the most ordinary human sense, alone. His health was already failing, migraines so severe they left him bedridden for days, sometimes weeks, near blindness that forced him to write in enormous, staggering letters, nausea so constant that eating was a negotiation with his own body, insomnia that turned night into a second, more honest kind of waking. He resigned from Basel at 34, the youngest professor in the university's history, leaving with nothing but a small pension and a suitcase full of manuscripts no one wanted to publish. And for the next decade, he wandered, Nice, Sils Maria, Turin, Genoa, Venice, cheap rented rooms with thin walls and bad light. He wrote in the mornings when his eyes would cooperate, walked in the afternoons, long solitary hikes through alpine passes that became, in a way, the physical rhythm of his thinking, and spent his evenings alone, sending letters to friends who increasingly didn't answer, publishing books at his own expense that sold in the dozens, not the hundreds, the dozens. This is not the biography of a conqueror. This is the biography of a man who was systematically stripped of every comfort the world offers: career, friendship, love, health, recognition, and who, in that stripping, found something, not peace. Nietzsche never found peace. He found clarity, the kind of clarity that only comes when every illusion has been burned away and you are standing in the ash, still breathing, and you realize, I have to build something here, not because anyone is watching, because there is nothing else left to do. And the first thing he built was a bomb. In 1882, in a book called The Gay Science, Nietzsche wrote a passage that would become one of the most misunderstood sentences in the history of Western thought. God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. This is not an atheist's victory lap. Read the full passage. The man who says these words, the madman, Nietzsche calls him, is not celebrating. He is terrified. He runs into the marketplace with a lantern in broad daylight, searching for God the way you'd search for someone who's gone missing. And when he announces what has happened, The people in the marketplace laugh at him. They don't understand what he's saying. They think he's talking about church attendance. He isn't. How could we drink up the sea? The madman asks. Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Where is it moving to now? Where are we moving to? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward in all directions? Is there still any up or down? What Nietzsche means by God is dead is not that people have stopped believing. It's that the entire framework that gave Western civilization its sense of meaning, the idea that there is an objective moral order, a cosmic plan, a reason why things happen, a final judgment that makes all suffering worthwhile, has collapsed, not in a dramatic explosion, in a slow leak. And most people haven't noticed yet because they're still living inside the structure. The walls are still standing, but the foundation is gone. Think about what this means. Every should you've ever been handed, be humble, be good, work hard, be fair, sacrifice for others, defer to something larger than yourself. All of it was built on the assumption that there is some authority above you that validates those instructions. God, nature, reason, history, progress, the universe, whatever name you gave it. And Nietzsche is saying that authority is gone, not argued away, not disproven in a lab. It simply stopped functioning as the ground beneath your feet, and now you're walking on air and pretending the floor is still there. The madman sees this. The crowd doesn't. And so the madman smashes his lantern on the ground and says, I have come too early. This tremendous event is still on its way. It has not yet reached the ears of men. He was right. He was about 140 years early. You feel this. Maybe you don't call it the death of God. Maybe you call it the feeling that nothing quite adds up, that the values you were given don't match the world you actually live in, that you go through the motions, career, relationships, ambition, the slow accumulation of things that are supposed to mean something, and there's a hollowness underneath it all that you can't name but can't ignore, a hum, a vibration in the floor that tells you the building is not as solid as it looks. That hollowness is what Nietzsche diagnosed, not as a problem to be solved, as a condition to be faced. And here is where most people turn away, because facing it means accepting something almost unbearable, that suffering has no inherent meaning, that pain is not a test, not a purification, not a step towards something better. It's just pain. And you are the one who has to decide whether it serves you or destroys you. There is no cosmic ledger keeping score, no reward waiting at the end. Just the raw fact of being alive in a universe that did not ask for your opinion and will not mourn your absence. Nietzsche didn't romanticize suffering. He wasn't the philosopher of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, though he did write something close to that, and it has been flattened into a gym poster ever since. What he actually believed was more severe. Suffering strips you. It removes the things you thought you needed. The beliefs, the comforts, the stories you tell yourself about who you are and why you matter. And in that removal, if you are honest enough and strong enough, you see what was actually holding you up and what was just decoration. Most people redecorate. They find a new god, productivity, ideology, the approval of strangers on the internet, a political identity that provides the same certainty religion used to, and they rebuild the same structure with different wallpaper. They never stand in the open. Nietzsche wanted something else. He wanted to stand in the open air, and he wanted to know if you could stand there with him. To stand in the open air, you have to understand how you got indoors in the first place. Nietzsche spent the middle years of his work doing something that no philosopher before him had attempted with such ferocity. He didn't just ask, what is good and evil? He asked, who decided, and what did they have to gain by deciding it that way? In 1887, he published On the Genealogy of Morals, 3 essays that function like a controlled demolition of Western ethics. The book is dense, furious, and at times deliberately cruel. It reads like the work of a man who has been watching humanity lie to itself for so long that his patience has curdled into something sharper. But the core insight is almost painfully simple once you see it. There are 2 fundamental ways that human beings create values. Nietzsche calls them master morality and slave morality. And despite the names, which have caused more misunderstanding than almost any terms in philosophy, this is not about literal masters and literal slaves. It's about psychology. It's about the posture from which you face the world, the direction your values flow. Master morality begins with a feeling of fullness. You are strong, capable, overflowing with energy and health, and from that overflow, you create. You call what you are good, not because a book told you to, not because a priest approved, because you looked at yourself and the life pouring through you and said, this is worthy, this vitality, this strength, this capacity to act, this is what good means. Everything that resembles you, courage, beauty, generosity that comes from having more than you need, gets the label good. And everything that doesn't, weakness, timidity, smallness, the inability to act, gets called bad. Not evil, just lesser. The way a lion might regard a rabbit, not with hatred, with something closer to indifference. The master's values are created from the inside out. They flow from what he is toward the world. He doesn't need an enemy to know what he values. He values himself, and the world arranges itself around that. Slave morality begins somewhere completely different. It begins with pain. You are the one who was conquered, humiliated, made to kneel. You are the one whose body was used, whose labor was taken, whose voice was never asked for. And from that position of real, concrete suffering, you do something remarkable, something Nietzsche considered one of the most creative acts in human history. You invert the values. You look at the strong, the ones who conquered you, who took what they wanted, who lived without apology, and you say, they are evil, not just different, not just stronger, not just fortunate, evil, morally corrupt, damned, and then, by opposition, you declare that your weakness is goodness, your suffering is virtue, your inability to fight back is mercy, your poverty is holiness, your meekness is grace. This is not stupidity. Nietzsche is very clear about this. This is genius. He calls the slave revolt in morality one of the most successful operations ever executed on the human species. It didn't just change who was on top. It changed the entire game. It changed what on top meant. It made strength itself suspicious. It made power something to apologize for. It made the meek, not the bold, not the brave, not the creative, the inheritors of the earth. And it did this so thoroughly, so completely, that 2,000 years later, most of the Western world still lives inside the moral architecture it built without knowing who built it or why. You see this everywhere once you know how to look. And that's the danger of reading Nietzsche. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The co-worker who has never taken a risk in her life but speaks with quiet contempt about anyone who has ambition. She doesn't call herself resentful. She calls herself grounded, realistic, not caught up in the rat race. But listen to what she says about the people who try. Listen to the edge in her voice when someone gets promoted. That edge is not wisdom. It's revenge dressed as detachment. The friend who calls every successful person lucky or privileged, never talented, never disciplined, never someone who simply wanted something and went after it. In this friend's moral universe, success is always stolen. Achievement is always suspect. and their own lack of achievement is always someone else's fault, or even better, a sign of their moral purity. They didn't sell out. They didn't compromise. They stayed true, and if staying true looks exactly like staying still, well, that's just the price of integrity. The entire online ecosystem that has turned resentment into a philosophy, where the highest virtue is being a victim and the greatest sin is being strong enough not to need anyone's permission, where every act of creation is scrutinized for the power it conceals, but the act of tearing down is always righteous. Nietzsche had a word for this: ressentiment. He used the French deliberately to mark it as something specific, something more precise and more dangerous than ordinary resentment. Ressentiment is not just anger at someone who has what you don't. It's the creative transformation of that anger into an entire moral universe. It's the process by which the powerless don't just cope with their powerlessness, they sanctify it. They build a cathedral around it, and then they worship inside that cathedral and call it truth. The person filled with ressentiment doesn't say, "I wish I were stronger." They say, "Strength is corrupt." They don't say, "I failed." They say, "Success is immoral." They don't say, "I want what they have." They say, "What they have isn't worth wanting." And the terrifying part, the part that makes Nietzsche's analysis so devastating, is that they believe it. They've built such an elaborate architecture of justification, such a complete moral world, that the resentment is invisible, even to them, especially to them. And here, Nietzsche makes a move that separates him from every lazy contrarian who has ever used his work to justify being cruel. He does not say master morality is good and slave morality is bad. He says the slave revolt was brilliant. He says it was one of the most creative, world-altering events in human history. He almost admires it, the way you might admire a virus for its elegance. What he objects to is the dishonesty. The slave revolt works precisely because it hides what it is. It presents resentment as love. It presents weakness as choice. It presents the inability to take power as the refusal to take power. And that lie, that foundational, structural, invisible lie, is what Nietzsche wants to expose. This is the machinery running beneath so much of what passes for morality. Not all of it. Nietzsche is not saying that every act of compassion is secretly resentful or that every ethical claim is a power grab, but he is saying, look closer. Ask who benefits. Ask what feeling lives beneath the principle. A man who gives to charity because he is overflowing with life and wants to share it, that is one thing. A man who gives to charity so he can feel superior to those who don't, that is something else entirely. The action is identical. The soul behind it is opposite. And Nietzsche goes further. He traces this pattern back to its historical roots, to the moment when an enslaved people, conquered and humiliated, looked at their conquerors and performed the most audacious act of psychological warfare the world has ever seen. He is talking about ancient Judea, about a priestly class that, unable to defeat Rome with swords, defeated it with values. They said, "The powerful are damned, the meek are blessed. The kingdom belongs not to those who take it, but to those who suffer." And this message, fragile, implausible, spoken from the margins, conquered the empire that had conquered them. It took centuries, but it worked. Rome fell, and the slave's morality became the morality of the Western world. Nietzsche is not anti-Semitic here, whatever his sister later tried to make of his work. He is awestruck. He is describing what he considers the most consequential psychological event in history, and he is saying, this was not an accident. This was genius born from pain. but it was still born from pain, and the pain is still inside it, hidden, running the machinery from underneath. And then there are the priests. Nietzsche uses this term broadly. He doesn't just mean men in collars. He means anyone who gains power through renunciation. The ascetic ideal, the belief that self-denial, suffering, and the rejection of the body lead to something higher, is, for Nietzsche, the most cunning expression of the will to power in human history. The priest says, "I don't want power. I don't want pleasure. I don't want the things of this world." And precisely because he says this, precisely because he positions himself as above desire, beyond appetite, he becomes the most powerful figure in the room. Because now he sets the terms. He decides what higher means. He decides what counts as virtue and what counts as sin. He makes everyone else feel guilty for wanting what they naturally want: food, pleasure, beauty, strength, sex, dominance, creation. He becomes the gatekeeper of moral worth, which is just another way of saying the gatekeeper of social power. You know this figure, maybe not in a church, maybe in an office, the person who performs selflessness so loudly that it becomes a weapon, the manager who sacrifices everything for the team and then uses that sacrifice as leverage every time a decision needs to be made, the activist who has renounced personal ambition and now wields moral authority like a blade, cutting down anyone who hasn't renounced as completely, who still has the bad taste to want things for themselves, the intellectual who disdains popularity but carefully, meticulously cultivates an audience of people who admire him for disdaining popularity. Nietzsche saw through all of it, not because he was cynical, because he was honest in a way that made people afraid of him. He believed that the will to power, the fundamental drive to grow, to overcome, to impose form on chaos, to become more than you are, is inescapable. It runs through everything, through the saint and the sinner, the tyrant and the servant, the artist and the critic, and when you deny it, when you pretend you don't have it, when you build an entire identity around not wanting power, it doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It comes out sideways, as guilt, as moral superiority, as the quiet, almost sexual pleasure of watching someone more powerful fall. He even turned this lens on philosophy itself. In Twilight of the Idols, he takes apart Socrates, not his arguments, but his body. Socrates was ugly. Visitors to Athens remarked on it. Travelers who met him said he looked like a criminal, a figure from the underclass. And Nietzsche suggests, with that surgical cruelty he was so capable of, that Socrates' entire philosophical method was a response to this. Dialectics, the art of winning through relentless questioning, through making your opponent contradict himself, through the slow, grinding machinery of logic, was the weapon of a man who couldn't win through presence, through beauty, through the natural authority that the Greeks worshipped above almost everything. It was the revenge of the physically weak on the physically strong, dressed up as the love of wisdom. This is not an ad hominem attack. It's something deeper. Nietzsche is proposing that all philosophy, all of it, is autobiography, that the ideas a person produces cannot be separated from the body that produces them, the pain it has endured, the desires it cannot fulfill, the resentments it has nursed. Every great philosophy so far, he wrote, has been the personal confession of its author and a kind of involuntary and unconscious memoir. Your body shapes your thought. Your wounds shape your values. Your resentments shape your morality, and until you are willing to look at that, to trace your own truths back to the feelings that produced them, to follow your highest ideals down into the basement where they were actually built, you are not thinking. You are rationalizing. You are dressing up your desires as principles and your fears as ethics and calling it philosophy or justice or just the way things should be. This is uncomfortable. It should be. Nietzsche is not giving you a better morality to replace the one he's dismantling. He's not building a new church on the ruins of the old one. He's giving you a mirror. And what most people do with an uncomfortable mirror is put it face down and walk away and tell their friends the mirror was defective. But there are those who don't walk away. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the strangest, most ambitious, most uneven book Nietzsche ever wrote, there is a passage near the beginning called On the Three Metamorphoses. It describes 3 transformations of the spirit, not stages of life you pass through and leave behind. Transformations of how you carry yourself in relation to everything you've been given. The first is the camel. The camel is the spirit that kneels down and asks to be loaded. What is the heaviest thing? The camel asks. Let me take it on. The camel wants to carry. It wants tradition, duty, difficulty. It walks into the desert bearing everything its culture has placed on its back, the values, the obligations, the inherited thou shalts that have accumulated over centuries, and it carries them willingly, eagerly even, not because it's weak, because it is strong enough to bear the weight. This is where most serious people begin. You read the books your civilization considers important. You follow the rules that generations before you established. You apprentice yourself to the accumulated wisdom of the dead, and you carry it because you respect it, because you understand that you didn't invent the world, and that the people who came before you were not fools. There is genuine nobility in the camel. Nietzsche does not mock it. The camel is the person who knows that you have to understand the weight before you have the right to set it down. The rebel who skips the camel stage, who refuses tradition without ever having carried it, isn't free. He's just ignorant. He's a lion with nothing to fight, roaring at shadows. But the desert changes you. Slowly, under the burden, something shifts. The weight that once felt meaningful starts to feel arbitrary. The thou shalts begin to sound like the voices of people who are dead, or who never thought hard enough about what they were commanding. You start to notice that some of the tablets on your back contradict each other, that the tradition you're carrying was built by people with their own resentments, their own blind spots, their own will to power operating under the mask of eternal truth. And the spirit begins to bristle. It begins to resist. And in that resistance, it transforms into the lion. The lion's word is, I will, not thou shalt, I will. The lion faces the great dragon of duty. Nietzsche literally imagines a dragon covered in golden scales, and on every scale is inscribed a thou shalt, going back thousands of years. And the lion says, no, I will not carry this any longer. Not because I am too weak to bear it, because I have borne it long enough to know that it is not mine. I did not make it, I did not choose it, and I will not let it define me. The lion cannot create new values. That's crucial. Nietzsche is very specific about this. The lion's power is entirely negative. It destroys, it clears, it says no with the full force of its being. It is the revolutionary, the iconoclast, the person who has torn down everything their parents believed, everything their culture taught, everything they were told was sacred, and now stands in the wreckage, proud and empty. And this is the stage most people mistake for the destination, the permanent rebel, the person who has made a career of critique, the atheist who thinks about God more than any priest, the political radical who defines himself entirely by what he is against, the intellectual who can dismantle any argument but cannot build a single thing, the person at every dinner party who knows exactly what's wrong with everything and has never once offered what might be right. The lion is necessary, you cannot skip it, But if you stay the lion, you become something Nietzsche saw everywhere and despised, a no that never becomes a yes, a destruction that never leads to creation, a freedom from that never becomes a freedom too. The lion's roar is magnificent, but you cannot live in a roar. And so the spirit must transform one final time into the child. This is the hardest to understand, and Nietzsche knew it. The child is not innocence as regression. It is not naivety, not the wide-eyed ignorance of someone who has never suffered. It is what happens when you have carried the full weight of tradition, destroyed it with your own hands, grieved it, and then, from that cleared ground, that scorched and open earth, begin to play, to create, not because an authority told you to, not in reaction against an authority you hate, but because creation is what you are when everything else has been burned away. The child is innocence and forgetting, Zarathustra says, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelled wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. A sacred yes, not a yes to everything, not optimism, not the shallow positivity of someone who has never looked down, a yes that comes after the deepest no you are capable of, a yes that has weight precisely because it has passed through negation and come out the other side, a yes that knows what it is affirming because it has already destroyed everything that was false. This is Nietzsche's vision, not the strong man, not the rebel, not the critic or the cynic or the man who stands above it all with a sneer. The creator, someone who makes values the way an artist makes a painting, not by copying what came before, not by destroying other paintings, but by standing before a blank surface and saying, "This is what I see. This is what I affirm. This is the shape I give to my time on earth." And then he poses the question that tests whether you mean it. In The Gay Science, section 341, Nietzsche imagines a demon who comes to you in your loneliest loneliness and says, "This life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself." The eternal recurrence, not a cosmological theory about the nature of time, a psychological test, a thought experiment designed with the precision of a scalpel to cut through every lie you tell yourself about your own life. Could you hear that sentence and not collapse? Could you want this life again? Not a better version, not the edited highlights, not the life you tell people about at parties, but all of it. The failure, the boredom, the 3 a.m. despair that has no name, the love you lost, the chances you didn't take, the years that felt wasted, the moments of cruelty you'd rather forget. Could you take all of that and say to the demon, "You are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine"? That is what it means to affirm life, not to enjoy it, not to be happy, to want it, to choose it, to say this, all of this, exactly as it was and will be, yes. Nietzsche called this amor fati, love of fate, not acceptance, not resignation, not everything happens for a reason. Love, the kind of love that looks at necessity, at the brute, indifferent fact of what has happened, and embraces it, not because it was good, because it was yours, because you cannot separate the pain from the person it made you into, and to reject the pain is to reject yourself. "My formula for greatness in a human being," he wrote, "is amor fati, that one wants nothing to be different, not forward, not backward, not in all eternity, not merely bear what is necessary, but love it." This is not a doctrine for the comfortable. It is the most demanding idea Nietzsche ever articulated. It asks you to take the worst thing that ever happened to you, the betrayal, the loss, the failure that still wakes you at night, and to say, I would not erase it, because erasing it would erase everything that came after, including whatever I am now, standing here, still breathing, still building. Most people can't. Nietzsche suspected he couldn't either, and this is where the story turns. In January of 1889, on a street in Turin, Friedrich Nietzsche walked out of his boarding house and saw a coachman beating a horse. He crossed the street, threw his arms around the horse's neck, and collapsed. He wept. He may have whispered something to the animal, though we don't know what. He never recovered. He spent the last 11 years of his life in a state of progressive mental collapse, first in an asylum in Basel, then in the care of his mother in Naumburg, and finally under the control of his sister Elizabeth, who would spend decades editing, distorting, and weaponizing his work for her own nationalist and anti-Semitic agenda. There is something unbearable about this image. The man who wrote more ferociously about strength than anyone in the history of philosophy, broken by an act of pity for a suffering animal. The man who attacked compassion as the morality of the weak, undone by compassion. The man who imagined the Ubermensch, the human being who creates values, who affirms life in its totality, who dances at the edge of the abyss with laughter in his throat, could not in the end become that figure himself. And here is where you have to be honest about Nietzsche in a way that most of his admirers refuse to be. Because the internet has turned him into a brand, a collection of quotes on dark backgrounds, a mascot for people who confuse cruelty with strength and detachment with wisdom. They take the hardest edges of his thought and file away everything that bleeds. But Nietzsche bled. He bled constantly. He was, in many ways, a creature of the very ressentiment he diagnosed, a man who wrote about the body as the source of philosophy, while his own body was in open revolt, a man who praised solitude while aching for connection, writing letters that border on begging, extending invitations that were rarely accepted, constructing imaginary readers for books that had no real ones. A man who attacked pity while being, at his core, one of the most pitiful figures in the history of thought, not in the contemptuous sense, but in the literal one. A man who deserved pity, a man who needed it, and couldn't admit it. His philosophy is not weakened by this, it is deepened, because Nietzsche never claimed to be the Ubermensch. He never said, "Follow my example." He pointed, he described, he wrote with a precision and fury that still burns more than a century later, and he saw the summit more clearly than anyone has before or since. But he could not reach it. He saw the open air. He described what it would feel like to stand there, and then his body and his mind failed him, and he spent his last years in a chair by a window, being tended by people who didn't understand a word he had written. "I am one thing," he wrote in Ex Homo, the autobiography he composed in the last weeks before his collapse. "My writings are another." This is the honesty that makes Nietzsche more than a philosopher. It makes him human. The contradiction between what he wrote and what he lived is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. Because the point was never to arrive. The point was never to stand at the summit and plant a flag. The point was to see clearly, even when what you see includes your own failure, even when the mirror shows you exactly what you are, and what you are falls short of everything you imagined. So where does this leave you? Not with answers. Nietzsche doesn't give answers. He gives sight. He hands you a lens ground from his own suffering and says, look at your values, trace them back, find out where they came from, not the story you tell yourself. but the actual feeling underneath, the original wound, the first fear. Are you good because goodness overflows from you? Because you have so much life in you that generosity is its natural expression? Or are you good because you're afraid of what would happen if you weren't? Afraid of punishment, afraid of exile, afraid that the people who love you would stop? Are you humble because you have so much that humility is a gift you give to others? Or are you humble because you've been beaten down so many times that humility was the only safe posture left, the only way to stop being hit? Do you serve others because your cup is full and it spills over naturally, or because an empty cup is the only one anyone ever praised you for holding? These are not comfortable questions. They are not meant to be. Nietzsche is not your therapist. He is not going to help you feel better about yourself. He is the friend who tells you the thing no one else will say, the thing you already half know and have spent years avoiding. And then he walks away and lets you sit with it in the dark. The freedom he offers is not the freedom to do whatever you want. It is not permission to be selfish or cruel or indifferent to the suffering of others. It is the freedom to stop pretending, to look at the moral framework you inherited, the one that tells you what to want, who to admire, what a good life looks like, what you should feel guilty about, and to ask with genuine courage, is this mine? Did I choose this? Or was it placed on my back while I was still too young to refuse, while I was still a camel kneeling in the sand, eager for weight? And if the answer is that you didn't choose it, then you are standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying and real. The open air that Nietzsche spent his whole life trying to reach, a place with no ceiling, no safety net, no voice from above telling you that your suffering means something, that your goodness will be rewarded, that someone somewhere is keeping track, just you, and whatever you decide to build. That is frightening, of course it is. Nietzsche never pretended otherwise. Freedom is not a gift. It is a weight. The heaviest weight, heavier than any of the camel's burdens, because at least those came with instructions. The open air has no instructions. It has no floor and no ceiling and no one standing at the edge telling you which direction to walk. And many people, when they get their first real glimpse of it, turn around. They go back to the old structure. They find a new ideology, a new leader, a new set of thou shalts to kneel before. Not because they're stupid, because standing in the open is genuinely terrifying, and not everyone is built for it, and that is not a moral failing, it is just a fact. But some don't turn around, some stand there, shaking maybe, uncertain, with no guarantee that what they build will last or matter or be understood. And they begin anyway, not with a grand declaration, with a single act, a single value chosen freely, a single yes that is entirely their own. That is the beginning, not the end, the beginning. He wrote near the end a line that is less famous than God is dead, but may be more important. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. He found this line in someone else's work, but he understood it more deeply than the man who wrote it. Because Nietzsche knew the how, he lived it. The migraines, the blindness, the loneliness, the horse in Turin, he bore it. Not gracefully, not triumphantly, but he bore it. The why is yours to make. Not to find, not to receive, not to decode from the stars or extract from a sacred text, to make, from the raw material of your own pain, your own desire, your own sacred yes, spoken into a silence that will never answer back. Nietzsche couldn't finish what he started. His body gave out. His mind followed. He spent his last decade in silence, a silence more complete than any he had ever known, because it was not chosen. The man who had filled thousands of pages with the most incendiary prose in the history of Western philosophy sat in a chair by a window and said nothing. His sister dressed him in white robes and displayed him to visitors like a relic. She edited his unpublished notes into a book called The Will to Power and stamped it with ideas he would have despised. The final cruelty, not death, but being rewritten by someone who never understood a word you said. But the real words survived. And they are not words of comfort. They are words of fire. They burn away everything that isn't yours, every inherited guilt, every borrowed value, every should that was never a want, until you are standing in the open, lighter than you've ever been and more afraid than you've ever been, and for the first time in your life, free. That's all. If this reached you, if something here stayed after the rest faded, you might want to be here for the next one. Subscribe. It's the only way to know when it arrives. And if not, that's fine too. You were here. That was enough.